What if I told you the most dangerous moment for a narcissist is not when you argue with them, but when you finally understand them? The moment you stop being confused is the moment they start becoming uncomfortable. Because once they realize you can see the patterns, the manipulation, and the emotional games, everything changes. And what happens next often surprises people. If you have ever felt like someone changed their behavior the moment you became stronger or quieter, stay with me. What you are about to understand could explain years of confusion in your life. If this message is helping you see things more clearly, subscribe now. This channel is dedicated to helping you protect your peace. Like this video so more people over 60 can find this guidance. And comment clarity if you have started seeing the patterns. If this message is helping you see things more clearly, subscribe now. This channel is dedicated to helping you protect your peace. Like this video so more people over 60 can find this guidance, and comment clarity if you have started seeing the patterns. For a long time, one of the greatest strengths of a narcissistic personality is not intelligence, status, or even confidence. It is the mask they wear, a carefully built image designed to make others see what they want to show rather than who they really are. This mask is not always obvious. Sometimes it looks like charm, sometimes it looks like confidence, sometimes it even looks like kindness or authority. But behind it is often a very fragile need for control and validation. What many people do not realize is that this mask only works as long as people believe it without question. The moment you begin noticing inconsistencies, small contradictions, emotional patterns, or repeated manipulation tactics, something starts to change. You may not say anything at first. In fact, most people don't. Awareness usually begins silently. You simply start noticing. You begin remembering past conversations more clearly. You start connecting behaviors that once seemed unrelated. You may notice how apologies never come without excuses. You may notice how blame somehow always shifts back to you. You may notice how kindness sometimes appears only when they feel they are losing influence. These small observations begin forming a bigger picture, and this is the beginning of the mask cracking. Not because you exposed them publicly, not because you confronted them dramatically, but because internally, you are no longer accepting the performance at face value. You are now watching the pattern instead of the moment. This is very important because narcissistic behavior often depends on people reacting to individual incidents instead of recognizing long-term cycles. When you only see moments, you stay emotionally involved. When you see patterns, you become psychologically aware, and awareness changes how you respond. You may stop over-explaining yourself because you realize explanations were never the real issue. You may stop defending every accusation because you notice the accusations repeat no matter what you say. You may stop trying to prove your good intentions because you recognize that your intentions were never honestly being evaluated. And when your behavior changes, even slightly, the narcissist often senses it very quickly. At first, they may not understand what changed. They just feel something is different. Your reactions may be slower. Your emotional responses may be smaller. Your need to convince them may seem reduced. You may even appear calmer during situations that used to upset you. This is often deeply unsettling to them because the mask depends on predictable reactions. If criticism used to make you defend yourself and now you simply acknowledge and move on, they lose a familiar script. If guilt used to make you apologize and now you pause instead of reacting, the emotional rhythm they depended on starts breaking, and this is when they may begin testing the mask more actively. They might exaggerate a story to see if you challenge it. They might deny something obvious to see if you still accept their version of reality. They might even increase charm temporarily to see if you still respond the same way to praise. But when they start realizing these old tools no longer work the same way, something uncomfortable begins happening internally for them. They feel seen, not admired, not feared, seen. And for someone who carefully manages how they are perceived, this can feel extremely threatening, because being seen means the performance may no longer be enough. It means someone is paying attention not just to what they say, but to why they say it. Not just to their behavior, but to the intention behind it. And intention is much harder to hide once someone starts paying attention. This is why sometimes a narcissist may suddenly become irritated when you ask simple, calm questions. Questions like, why does this always happen this way? Or, why does the story change? Can feel more threatening than arguments. Because arguments can be dismissed as emotional. Calm observation is harder to dismiss. Observation removes the emotional smokescreen. Another important thing that begins happening is that you stop giving automatic benefit of the doubt. Not because you became negative, but because you became realistic. You start measuring behavior over time instead of promises in the moment. You begin trusting patterns more than words, and this alone weakens the mask significantly, because the mask often depends on words, promises, explanations, future plans, emotional statements. But when someone starts evaluating consistency instead of listening to declarations, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. Sometimes the narcissist may react by trying to repair the mask. This might look like sudden kindness, unexpected compliments, or temporary cooperation, not always consciously manipulative, but often driven by the discomfort of losing psychological position. Because if you stop believing the mask, they must either change behavior or risk losing influence. And many narcissistic personalities will try first to restore the image rather than change the pattern. But if your awareness continues, something even more powerful happens. You stop needing the mask to fall completely. You stop needing proof. You stop needing confession. You stop needing agreement from others. You simply trust what you consistently observe, and that is often the moment your power quietly returns, because you are no longer negotiating with the image. You are responding to the reality. And when someone realizes their image no longer controls your perception, they often become more cautious, not necessarily more honest, not necessarily more empathetic, but more careful, because they now understand something important. You are no longer reacting to who they pretend to be. You are responding to who they repeatedly show themselves to be. And perhaps the most important change is happening inside you, not inside them. You stop feeling confused. You stop feeling pulled into emotional puzzles. You stop trying to solve behavior that was never meant to make sense. Instead, you begin doing something much healthier. You begin protecting your peace based on what you see, not what you hope. And hope is often what kept the mask alive the longest. Hope that they would understand. Hope that they would be fair. Hope that they would be consistent. But awareness replaces false hope with clear vision. Not bitter vision. Not angry vision. Just clear vision. And once you see clearly, the mask does not need to fall publicly to lose its power over you, because the real change is this: it no longer works on you. And when the mask stops working on you, the entire psychological dynamic begins to change. When a narcissist begins to realize that their usual methods of influence are no longer working on you, one of the most common reactions is not sadness, not reflection, and not accountability. It is escalation. Not always loud at first, but noticeable. Because when control starts slipping, many narcissistic personalities instinctively try to regain it. And this is often where people begin noticing a colder or more aggressive side they may not have seen so clearly before. At the beginning of many narcissistic dynamics, control often looks subtle. It may come through charm, persuasion, guilt, or emotional dependency. But when those softer strategies stop producing results, the tone can change. Not always dramatically, but enough to make you feel the difference. You may notice more sarcasm, more dismissive comments, more impatience. Conversations may feel shorter, sharper, or strangely tense. Sometimes they may act irritated by things they once ignored. Sometimes they may appear emotionally distant, as if withdrawing warmth that once seemed available. This shift is not random. It often comes from a simple psychological reaction. When influence decreases, pressure increases. Because from their perspective, something important is happening. They may feel you are becoming less responsive, less impressed, less emotionally affected. And this can feel like loss of position. Not necessarily loss of love in their mind, but loss of psychological leverage. And leverage is often what they try to restore. Aggression does not always mean shouting or obvious anger. Sometimes aggression looks like subtle disrespect, talking over you, minimizing your concerns, ignoring your boundaries, acting as if your needs are inconvenient. These are often attempts to push you back into a more compliant position without openly admitting they feel challenged. It is important to understand something here. This reaction is often not about you becoming difficult. It is about you becoming less controllable. And less controllable people are often treated differently by controlling personalities. Some narcissistic individuals may also attempt something else during this phase: emotional punishment. This might look like withdrawal of attention, cold behavior, or selective kindness. They may become warm when you are agreeable and distant when you assert independence. This creates an emotional contrast designed to make you question whether your strength is worth it. But what is really happening is very different. They are testing whether your boundaries are permanent or temporary. Because if pressure makes you return to old behaviors, they learn the old methods still work. But if you remain steady, calm, and consistent, they begin realizing something more serious is changing. Your psychological position is stabilizing. Another reaction that can appear is intimidation through confidence. They may suddenly act more certain, more dismissive, or more authoritative. This is often an attempt to reestablish hierarchy, not necessarily because they feel stronger, but sometimes because they feel less secure and are compensating. This is why sometimes their confidence may feel more forced during this period, because it is not coming from comfort, it is coming from reaction. And people often misunderstand this phase. They think, maybe I did something wrong, maybe I became too distant, maybe I should explain myself more. But often what they are witnessing is not damage they caused, it is resistance they are seeing. Resistance not through fighting, resistance through self-respect. And self-respect is something that can feel like rejection to someone used to emotional access without limits. There is also something else happening psychologically during this stage. When narcissists feel seen, they sometimes experience what feels like exposure. Not public exposure, but internal exposure. The feeling that someone now understands their patterns. And this can create defensiveness. Defensiveness sometimes comes out as anger, because anger feels stronger than vulnerability. Coldness sometimes replaces connection because distance feels safer than being psychologically understood. And increased criticism sometimes appears because criticism can push attention away from their own behavior. These reactions are often less about hurting you intentionally and more about regaining emotional balance in a way they know how. Unfortunately, their way of regaining balance often involves regaining control, and this is why your reaction during this phase matters so much. Not dramatic reaction, not emotional collapse, not aggressive counterattacks, just consistency, because consistency sends a message stronger than any argument. I am not moving back into old patterns. When you stay calm while they become colder, you show emotional stability. When you maintain boundaries while they apply pressure, you show psychological strength. When you stop over-explaining while they provoke, you show independence. And independence often forces a recalculation. They begin realizing that aggression is not producing the same results, that intimidation is not restoring the same reactions, that coldness is not pulling you back emotionally the way it once might have. And this is often when behavior becomes more careful, not always kinder, but more measured, because they begin understanding something important. Force is no longer effective, and perhaps the most important thing for you to remember during this stage is this. Their increased coldness is not proof you are losing. It is often evidence you are no longer easy to control, because people rarely escalate pressure when they already have influence. Pressure usually increases when influence is decreasing. So if you notice this change, the real question is not why are they acting this way. The more important question is, what changed in me that this behavior no longer works the same way? And often the answer is very simple. You stopped reacting automatically. You stopped accepting emotional confusion. You stopped prioritizing their comfort over your peace. And that is often when the dynamic begins to shift permanently. Not because they changed first, but because you did. There comes a very subtle but very important turning point when a narcissistic personality begins to sense they are losing psychological power over you. On the outside, they may still appear confident, composed, or even unaffected. But internally, something very different can begin to happen. What once felt like certainty for them can slowly begin to turn into uneasiness. What once felt predictable can start to feel unstable, and behind that shift, something they rarely show openly can begin to grow: fear. Not fear in the way most people think of fear, not panic, not obvious anxiety, but a quieter form of fear that comes from losing control over how someone sees them and responds to them. For a long time, their confidence may have depended on something very simple: knowing how to affect you, knowing which words would make you explain yourself, knowing which criticisms would make you defend yourself, knowing which emotional buttons would create predictable reactions. Predictability often feels like power to controlling personalities, but when you begin seeing the patterns, when you begin responding instead of reacting, when you begin choosing calm instead of confusion, that predictability begins to disappear. And unpredictability can create discomfort because now they are no longer fully sure what will work. If guilt no longer makes you apologize immediately, they notice. If criticism no longer makes you anxious, they notice. If silence no longer makes you chase them emotionally, they notice. And when these familiar responses disappear, something important disappears with them: their psychological map of you. Before, they may have felt they understood how to move conversations, how to shift emotional direction, how to regain control if they felt challenged. But now the map does not work the same way. The emotional shortcuts are gone. And when someone loses the map they used to navigate influence, hesitation begins replacing certainty. That hesitation is often where fear begins, not fear of you as a person, but fear of losing influence. fear of losing emotional access, fear of no longer being able to shape the dynamic the way they once did. And what often replaces their old confidence is observation. They may begin watching what you say more carefully, watching what you do not say even more carefully. They may start paying closer attention to your tone, your distance, your independence, not necessarily because they want to understand you emotionally, but because they are trying to understand the new balance of power. Because when psychological power shifts, awareness increases. This is why sometimes people notice something surprising. When they become calmer and more self-assured, the narcissist sometimes becomes less openly confrontational, not always nicer, but more cautious, less reckless, more measured in their approach, because they now understand something they did not have to consider before. You are no longer emotionally automatic, and emotionally automatic people are easier to control than emotionally aware people. There is also another kind of fear that can appear, the fear of exposure. Not always public exposure, but the fear that you now understand their methods, that you recognize the cycles, that you can anticipate behavior instead of being surprised by it. Because surprise is often part of how manipulation works, but awareness removes surprise, and when surprise disappears, so does much of the advantage. This does not mean they suddenly become vulnerable or honest. More often, it means they become more strategic. They may say less. They may test more carefully. They may choose their words more deliberately. This is not necessarily growth. Often it is adjustment, because when someone realizes they are no longer psychologically ahead in the dynamic, they often become more careful about their moves. And here is something very important many people misunderstand. This fear does not mean they suddenly respect you emotionally. It often means they begin respecting your boundaries psychologically. There is a difference. Emotional respect comes from empathy. Psychological respect often comes from recognizing limits, recognizing that certain behaviors will no longer produce the same results, recognizing that certain lines cannot be crossed without consequences like distance, silence, or disengagement. And people who recognize limits often behave differently than people who believe there are none. Your calm strength may not change their personality, but it often changes their calculations. Because if they sense you will no longer tolerate certain patterns, they must decide whether to adapt their behavior or lose access. And access is often very important to them. Access to your attention, access to your reactions, access to your emotional availability. When that access becomes limited, it creates pressure. Sometimes that pressure looks like irritation. Sometimes it looks like careful politeness. Sometimes it looks like distance. But underneath it is often the same realization. You are no longer emotionally dependent on their approval. And that realization can feel very destabilizing to someone who once relied on that dependence. Perhaps the most powerful part of this shift is not what happens inside them, but what has changed inside you. You are no longer trying to win. You are no longer trying to fix. You are no longer trying to decode every reaction. You are simply seeing without panic, seeing without urgency, seeing without needing to immediately respond. And that calm observation is often what creates the biggest psychological shift of all. Because calm awareness cannot be easily manipulated. It does not rush. It does not chase. It does not beg to be believed. It simply notices. And people who simply notice become very hard to control. Because control depends on emotional speed, fast reactions, fast guilt, fast fear, fast explanations. But awareness slows everything down. And slow emotional responses often look like strength. Not loud strength, not aggressive strength, but something much more unsettling to someone who depends on influence, unshakable inner stability. And when someone realizes they can no longer easily shake you, something changes in how they see you, not necessarily with admiration, but with caution. And sometimes, that caution is the closest thing to respect they know how to show. One of the more unexpected shifts that can happen when a narcissist realizes you understand their patterns is not louder conflict, but quieter behavior. Instead of direct attacks, instead of obvious confrontations, they may begin studying you more carefully, almost like someone trying to understand a new landscape after realizing the old map no longer works. This can feel confusing at first because many people expect open hostility when power dynamics change. But what often happens instead is observation, not warm curiosity, not healthy interest, but strategic attention. Because once they sense you are no longer easily influenced, they may begin trying to understand how much has really changed. They may start noticing what triggers you less. They may watch how you respond to criticism. They may test whether your boundaries are temporary or permanent. They may even appear quieter in conversations, not because they have become more respectful emotionally, but because they are trying to understand how to approach you now. This is often a major shift from earlier behavior, where they may have spoken more freely, criticized more casually, or pushed boundaries more openly. That earlier behavior often existed because they felt safe doing it, safe in the belief that the dynamic would remain the same. But once they sense awareness in you, they may begin calculating risk, because awareness creates consequences, not always loud consequences, but behavioral ones. Less access, less emotional reaction, less engagement. And when someone begins losing these things, they often become more cautious. This is why some people notice something very strange. The same person who once dismissed their feelings may now speak more carefully. The same person who once provoked arguments may now avoid certain topics. The same person who once seemed emotionally fearless may now appear more measured. This is not always transformation. Often it is adjustment, because when someone realizes their old strategies are visible, they often try new ones or become more subtle with old ones. This is why observation becomes one of their main tools. They may begin trying to figure out what still works and what no longer does. And this is where your consistency becomes extremely important, because they are not just watching what you say, they are watching what you tolerate. They are watching whether your calm behavior lasts. They are watching whether pressure makes you return to old habits. They are watching whether silence from them makes you chase connection again. In other words, they are studying whether your strength is situational or stable. This may sound uncomfortable, but it also reveals something important. When someone begins watching you instead of overpowering you, it often means the psychological balance has shifted. They no longer feel completely dominant in the dynamic. And when dominance feels uncertain, caution increases. Sometimes this can even look like politeness. But it is important to understand the difference between politeness coming from empathy and politeness coming from awareness of limits. One comes from emotional understanding. The other comes from recognizing consequences. And narcissistic personalities often respond more to consequences than explanations. Your reduced emotional availability may become one of those consequences, not through punishment, but through self-protection. When you stop giving unlimited emotional access, when you stop reacting instantly, when you stop explaining every boundary, they begin realizing the dynamic has changed, and people often behave differently when they realize access is no longer guaranteed. Another interesting thing that can happen is they may begin trying to gather information indirectly, asking questions in casual ways, bringing up topics to see your reaction, mentioning things to test whether you still feel the same emotional pressure. This is not always conscious strategy. Sometimes it is instinctive behavior from someone trying to regain a sense of orientation. Because when control decreases, uncertainty increases. And people who depend on control often try to reduce uncertainty by increasing observation. But here is the part that matters most for you. Their observation does not mean you need to become defensive. It does not mean you need to prove anything. It does not mean you need to perform strength. Your greatest protection in this phase is simply remaining natural and consistent. Not dramatic strength, not forced indifference, just steady self-respect. Because what often makes someone truly cautious is not one strong reaction. It is repeated calm stability. When they see that your boundaries remain the same on good days and difficult days, they notice. When they see that guilt no longer changes your decisions, they notice. When they see that pressure no longer creates emotional urgency, they notice. And when someone begins noticing that your behavior is no longer easily influenced, they often begin choosing their own behavior more carefully, not necessarily because they have changed internally, but because the environment has changed externally. You change the environment by changing your responses. And perhaps the most important realization in all of this is that you do not need to control how they see you. You do not need to manage their perception. You do not need to make them understand your growth. Your only real work is maintaining your clarity, because clarity removes your need to perform. You are not trying to intimidate them. You are not trying to defeat them. You are simply no longer participating in dynamics that cost you your peace. And that alone often creates a very different kind of presence, a presence that feels grounded, predictable in a healthy way, emotionally stable. And emotionally stable people often become very difficult to manipulate, Because manipulation depends on emotional instability. So when they begin watching you more carefully instead of attacking directly, it often reflects something simple but powerful. They are no longer sure they can move you the way they once could. And when someone realizes they can no longer easily move you, they often move more carefully themselves.